Hello, I'm Angela Princeville, and on this segment of Ask AP, the question I'll be answering is my ex-wife wants me to pay 50% of the cost of post-secondary schooling for our daughter, but I did not approve for all of the expenses. What are my options? So this is an interesting question, and it raises, a number of issues, right? So on the one hand, what jumps right off to me is the idea of consent. Most people understandably have concern when they're not being when their opinion is not sought before expenses are made, and then now they're being asked to contribute to it. So that's one. The other part that jumped right off to me is, well, 50%, is that really the share that the you should be paying in this case? And then of course, there's the question of the legitimacy of all of the expenses as a whole, anyway. So, of course, there's lots of other things we could pick at, but those are sort of the three things that jumped right out to me. So, I'm going to start with the easy one, which is the proportionate share or the sharing of the expenses. And a lot of times I find that people, just think, well, we have a child or children together and we should share their expenses equally. That may or may not be accurate. And really, the way the law is framed is the starting point or the presumption is that the expenses would be shared proportionate to income. So, if we have a scenario where one person is making 100,000 and another person is making $200,000, then obviously 50-50 would not be the appropriate way to share it. My math's not good enough to be able to get the answer to that one on the fly, but we do have programs that help us with these things. But yeah, you could look at what based on the incomes, and you can figure out what the proportionate sharing of that would be. But you can just see with such a large gap that 50-50 would not be the appropriate share. And it might seem obvious to some people, but trust me, it is not obvious to a lot of people. Many people assume that there's two parents, so expenses have to be split equally. And if you're fine with that and that works for your family, I'm not here to try to change that. But if there's any concerns around affordability, and if you're wondering sort of where does the law fall on that issue, then you should know that it will be looked at proportionate to incomes. And, it's not even, I don't want to give the impression that it's only when the gap is that much that the courts would look at proportionate sharing. I actually just received a decision from a motion that we did recently. And the difference is, I think, one party, my client, has to pay 53% and the other party 47%. So the difference in incomes between the parties was not a huge gap, but the proportionate sharing was not 50-50 regardless. So there is that. And then I'm going to jump to the other issue that I had mentioned, which is the reasonableness of the expense. And I'll deal with the issue of consent last. On the issue of reasonableness, I mean, there is a subjective element to that, right? But I mean, for the most part, I find that a lot of times when my clients are arguing about Section 7 expenses, it's always an issue that comes up. There's a difference, in values, there's a difference in what sort of educational experience one parent thinks is appropriate versus the other parent. And I mean, maybe there are no right or wrong answers here, but reasonableness will be determined legally from a perspective of the party's means. So what I mean by that is, if you have again two parents that are making over $1 million annually, maybe getting the child driving a brand new BMW, for example, might be a reasonable expense. Living in a penthouse apartment might be reasonable. Now, if you come down to two parents that are making $100,000 each, then obviously those expenses would not be considered reasonable, given again the cost of living these days in the GTA. Two parents having $100,000 income each would not be able to support that sort of lifestyle. So again, I just use those two extremes to highlight how reasonableness in one scenario would look different from another scenario. And these are looked at again in the lens of the parties' means and all of that. Now, again, of course, if one party is making 100,000 and the other is making 1 million. And, the children have gotten used to living a certain lifestyle before the parties separated. Even if the children are now living with the lower earning parent, it might be reasonable in those circumstances for them to enjoy a little bit of a higher lifestyle than maybe, another person may consider reasonable. So, in short, there is no one set standard of reasonableness. It's always going to be looked at based on the circumstances of the particular family that we're dealing with. So, what's the lifestyle the children were used to before separation? What are the incomes of the parties? What are their means? What are some the other obligations that um, you know would be reasonable to factor in before saying, well, this is all the amount of money that can be thrown towards their post-secondary education and sort of the lifestyle, or a better word would be the experience that you want the children to have at post-secondary. So that's why it's always important to get consent, because reasonableness, even with two parties that are making the same amount of money that maybe shared a similar vision during marriage, when the parties are now separated, their definitions of reasonableness might change. So it's always important to get consent so that there's no argument over the reasonableness of the expense or not. Because if you do consent, then I mean that kind of puts that issue to rest, right? And this is one that I find creates a lot of conflict because yes, the children are going to post-secondary. It is a Section 7 expense, and I should back up and say, in addition to child support, the law provides that you contribute to special and extraordinary expenses. And this is provided for in Section 7 of the child support guidelines. So often we just say Section 7 expenses. And one of the headings that's listed right there is post-secondary education expenses for a child. So it goes without saying that parents are expected, if they're able to, if they have the means to, are expected to contribute to the children's post-secondary expenses. So now the question in this case is the fact that this approval was not the person who was asking this question. Here, his approval was not sought before these expenses were made. Now, if this were, say expenses for some sort of sporting activity, extracurricular activity, I might be bold enough to even say you don't have to contribute anything. You can make an argument that you shouldn't have to contribute any amount at all because your approval was not sought in the first place. So that would be an argument available to you. However, because we're talking specifically about post-secondary expenses here, we can't do that because it's an enumerated head. It's very clear that that's something that parents will be expected to contribute for their child. Now, this ties into the reasonableness portion because if we're talking tuition, for example, so tuition, um, residency costs if the child's going to school away from home, and books, feeding if they're not living at home. Those are, I mean, I would say those are basic, and the reasonableness of those cannot be questioned. I mean, come on, and we're not going to argue about the cost of the tuition. I mean, we could have debates on our own about how expensive post-secondary education is, but that's not something we can argue in the context of contributing toward. Now, if a person's so if it's for those sort of basic things, unfortunately, yes, consent should have been sought. But if it's tuition, for example, and you're being asked to contribute to that, then I wouldn't get too caught up on the consent part of it because it's reasonable. If it's accommodations as well, that could be questionable, right? If the child is required to stay in residence, then that sort of it is what it is. The school fixes the cost, and then there's not much you can do there. But if the child stayed at, outside of campus, for example, which a lot of students do in their later years, then without consent, there could be a lot of this debate around the choices made, were there less expensive options. Now, if the child, was accommodated in the least expensive option possible for residents while they were in school, then there's really, even though your consent ought to have been sought, but it wasn't sought, um, I could predict that you will be asked to pay your proportionate share of that expense. And so we could kind of go down that line item, how much are you being asked to contribute towards feeding and transportation and things like that. And if it's reasonable, then unfortunately, I'll say this is one scenario where you're probably just best off paying for it and not having too much of and not arguing too much about it because it is post-secondary expenses. But if, lavish, decisions were made, so, the child stayed at the best, condo in town and driving the best cars, their means of transportation and things like that, and your consent was not asked before those decisions were made, then you can ask that you not pay. You would probably still be asked to make a reasonable contribution, but you may not have to pay that. And I use the word may, and I qualify that a lot because, again, remember what I talked about reasonableness? It's in line with your income and the lifestyle of the family before separation. So yes, if your income supports a scenario where the child should be living in the best apartment in town and given, the lifestyle that they were accustomed to, then of course, I would say as unfortunate as it should have, as unfortunate as it is, and despite the fact that your consent should have been sought first, there's no point in going down that route. Just pay your proportionate share. So to kind of tie it all together, when again the question is asking whether you should be paying 50% of post-secondary expenses when your approval for the expenses were not sought and what your options are in those scenario. Well, I would start first off by confirming that my proportionate contribution is 50%. Again, when you go down that route, understand that you may find out that you need to pay more than 50%, in which case then you just accept the 50%, or it may be that based on your incomes that you should be paying less. So that's step one. What's the appropriate proportionate sharing for these expenses? The second thing to look at is the reasonableness of these expenses that you're being asked to contribute to. And it's, you might, because it's post-secondary expenses, I'm saying you would not get that opportunity to just say a blanket, no, you're not contributing, except you're of very, very limited means, then that might be a possibility. But, for most people in the middle to the higher income class, you will be required to contribute, and you can look at the expenses and treat it as a line by line item and determine which ones are not reasonable and which you would not have consented to had your opinion being asked at the appropriate time. And then you take it from there. One last thing you want to consider as well is what contribution should the child be making towards their post-secondary education. So that's something that's contemplated by the law, that the child may contribute, and it would be nothing crazy. So looking at, did they work during the summers? What do they get? Do they have a trust set up for them? What kind of allowances are they receiving from grandparents? Whatever the case might be, just looking at the child's means as well and seeing if they're able to contribute. And if that's the case, obviously that would reduce your proportionate share of the post-secondary expenses. So I hope that answers your question on what could be this somewhat complex and contentious issue of Section 7 expenses. And that's why I usually generally say, what, the best thing is to always ask. Now, obviously, some people would say, well, I ask and I'm not getting a response and things like that. So if you're the person that's making these decisions and incurring these expenses, to avoid having to deal with a situation where you're not getting repaid because you did not ask for consent first, just go ahead and seek consent. And I think I have answered sort of the direct question that was put to me, and look at it again from the perspective of the reasonableness of the expense contribution a child can make, as well as making sure that you are paying your right proportionate share. And I think those are sort of the options that are available to you. I'm sure there are other little details here and there, but just on the broad questions, those would be my comments. And that is it from me today. So until next time, it's bye for now.